Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord. You guys know what phylacteries are? No? Little boxes that contained little pieces of the scriptures that in some places in Judaism were required to be worn across the forehead, and on the arm they were wrapped up with a leather band while they were praying certain prayers. So between that and the tassels, they were objects that communicated how devoted someone was to the faith. So make a little bit bigger phylactery, people are going to notice. You can call me Abba from now on. No, and again, that one, it's kind of, in some ways it's obvious that, this is one of those places where Jesus isn't speaking literally, because how many of you call your own father, Father, At least Dad. So just a couple of notes to start. There's a couple of points of contact with other things that I want to mention about our scriptures before really diving in, and those are this phrase we hear about today about the heavy burdens that the Pharisees are tying up and placing on people. It's a point of contact with Jesus' words 10 chapters ago in the book of the Gospel of Matthew, where he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You will find rest for yourself." So he's setting up the Pharisees as in just perfect contradiction with himself and the expectations and the burdens that he places on people. He walks with them and helps them to carry them. The other point of contact is with our gospel last week, where the Pharisees have come and asked him, what's the most important commandment in the law? And he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So those two things keep in mind as you heard the gospel already, and as you hear what I have to share, I suppose. All of that in context, the last chapter or so, a couple of chapters of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is kind of in the same place, and we constantly hear about the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to him and setting a trap, and it's like he's sitting in one place and he's teaching the crowds and his disciples in front of him, and these other groups keep coming. They keep coming with questions and traps again and again and again and again. And right before today's passage that we hear, he finally silenced them with the last question. And it was his question to them. And we don't hear it, at least at this point in our cycle of readings, but he asked them the question, how can King David call the Messiah, Jesus, Lord, if the Messiah is to be the son of David? It's kind of a paradox, and they walk away like they've been defeated. So we pick up today, and the scribes and the Pharisees are walking away, and the crowds and his disciples are still at his feet, and he's still teaching them. And he says, "Do whatever the Pharisees tell you to do, but don't do anything like they do it. You know, he's setting this up. He's still preaching to the crowds and the disciples. Yes, it's a message for the Pharisees, but it's really more for those who are interested in listening to what he has to say. And what's he really saying? For one, he's challenging the crowds to be able to discern the truth where it lies. That the scribes and the Pharisees and the leaders of their faith still say things that are true, and they're still worth following what they say. But the people have a responsibility to recognize that sometimes there's a difference between what's true and what those leaders are actually doing. It's interesting. Yes, he's challenging the scribes and the Pharisees to unite their hearts and their lives, and the commandments and their lives. But maybe even more so, he's challenging the disciples and the crowds to be able to tell the difference about what's right and what the leaders are actually doing. So there's a big challenge to the disciples and the crowds. Interspersed in that, too, is just a challenge to unite their hearts and minds and the commandments as well, so as not to fall into the trap that the Pharisees have fallen into in placing themselves in this place of judgment over the rest. Now, many of us don't have places in our lives where we actually have a certain place of authority where we can set the rules and the consequences and sit back and judge exactly whether or not people are following those things, but there's plenty of places in our lives where we do it anyway. And I heard a story this week that I think kind of captures it, and it's interesting. There's a lady who she's living in Atlanta. She's married with a son. He's about 2 years old. She's originally from Minnesota. And she finds out that her grandmother has passed away and she wants to attend the funeral. Well, her husband can't get off of work, so that means she's going to travel alone with a 2-year-old on an airplane and go spend a few days with her family. She decides that she's going to do it anyway. So she goes to Minnesota. She's with her family. The son gets sick along the way, and they had a terrible 3 days. Hardly any sleep, for either one of them. And they get back on the plane, and they're going to fly several hours back to Atlanta. So after a while, you can imagine, if you've ever traveled with a small child, things are starting to get a little bit ugly. I've never done it, but I've heard about it. So, the 2-year-old is being a 2-year-old. It's fine, just nobody else can get their own sleep or peace and quiet or whatever. And as the mother is trying to calm the child, she's so tired from the past 3 days that she's falling asleep right there in the seat. And all the while, the entire cabin is getting more and more annoyed. You know the complaints. Why should she even be traveling with a 2-year-old if she can't handle it? Everybody's thinking. Until one man, 50-some years old, he gets up and he goes to her and says, "I'm a parent too, and I know what you're going through. I've been there myself. Can I take your child up and down the aisle?" So she lets him do this. And for the next 2 hours, he spends pacing up and down the aisle because the child had calmed down. The mother had a chance to get her own rest. And the rest of the cabin was fine. There was no mutiny on board the airplane. But what was the difference? So many of the people on the airplane and so many of us in the same situation may have just sat there and said, "This lady doesn't know how to raise her own children." We've got expectations for people, and so judgments of them when they don't meet those expectations. And what did this man do? He came down from this place of judgment and entered into the life of this woman in this moment and walked with her through that difficulty. Remember those points of contact I mentioned. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus gives us the example of doing that, but also that place of loving God with our whole hearts and our neighbor as ourselves, which both connected right here, right there. What does he do? From the beginning, he's constantly saying, here's my life, I want you to have it. From the beginning of creation, throughout the Old Testament, and especially as he comes into the world, into those dark and challenging places of our lives, and walks with us. He comes down from the place that we see as a place of judgment in heaven, and walks with us on that road, teaching us to love. And he calls us too to come down from our place of judgment, to enter into the lives of others, and walk with them and help them carry their burdens. I don't know where you're at after hearing that story. I know in my own life I can imagine different places. Some for myself where I've been in that place of judgment, and some where I've seen it from others. There's places everywhere. We've got a lot of confirmation students with us today, preparing for confirmation this year. And I was just thinking a little bit about, my time in school as well. And, there's so many different places where I remember seeing someone who maybe even wasn't even doing anything all that wrong. A person who was carrying too many books and dropped them all over the floor. I remember thinking to myself, that was dumb. Shouldn't have been carrying so many books. But, did you stop to help pick them up? Either take them back or to the next place? There's things everywhere where, sometimes we don't even think about it, that we're stepping back, we're staying in this place of judgment and not coming down to walk with someone. There's bigger things in people's lives too, just the challenges they go through. Health issues, the loss of loved ones, financial situations, whatever. And there's so many different times where just being present to people, being a true friend who listens at times. There's a lot of different places where we can just enter into someone's life, where we can say like Jesus does, here's my life. I want you to have it. To learn to love as he loves with our entire minds and hearts and souls. And so, too, to love one another as we love ourselves, as we wish at times that someone would enter into our lives. I think there's two particular places we can reflect on this week and take with us, and that's one, where have other people stepped down from the place of judgment and entered into our lives to walk with us on the journey, especially when things are burdensome. And so in turn, where can, I enter into someone else's life? Or maybe we've never really recognized that, and we recognize we've never really done it ourselves. We've always just stepped back and let people do whatever they're going to do, whether good or bad. So in that case, how can I? Where are there places in my life where maybe I stay back in my place of judgment, but I could enter in and help out right there. I can enter into that person's life a little bit deeper. I can show them a little bit more time of day. I can listen a little bit longer than the 3 seconds I give them when I'm saying hello. And ask them if there's some way I can help out. How can we enter into the lives of other people and walk with them, share the yoke of Jesus Christ, and can continue on to carry the light burden that Jesus offers us?